So, after quite a bit of internal staff discussion, of which we probably don't have as much unanimity as we would like to have, we sort of pressed into the end here. There we are. So, again, sort of the issues that were in front of us, and we're trying to craft a set of recommendations for you. One was the Commission's goal to achieve target harvest rates in all areas. This year you requested that we present uncertainty to you in the assessed biomass and the realized harvest rates, and Steve went through some of these today in our briefing with you last week. We showed you even more of that. We have the continuing retrospective issues and biomass estimation, which is giving a lot of angst within the halibut assessment crew. We have continuing declining size at age, somewhat differently by areas, but in general a decline in size at age and the consequent effect on eBio, and the continued declines in coastwide eBio, although it's somewhat less than it was last year. So there were a number of things, and there's a lot of text on this slide, but there were a lot of issues in setting the catch limits this year. One of the things that you asked was for us to provide some explicit measures of uncertainty. We had done this previously in a sort of a conceptual sense. Bill Clark, Steve, and myself did this in 2004. What we don't have yet is a comprehensive framework for presenting all these sources of uncertainty that might be considered in it, and that's one of the things that we're trying to work through on the both the MSC process and just through the regular assessment process. One thing to stress, if you haven't got it by now, is that uncertainty exists in every stage of every assessment. I don't care who's doing it, and the harvest projection, and it certainly is included in those for halibut. So we're certainly not in a unique situation here. In any of these complex assessments, you have uncertainty and or error in the data that you're putting into it and the process description and so forth. It's obviously a very complicated process, and it's going to have sources of uncertainty all the way along the way. What we've tried to do in part of Stephen's presentation is to sort of try to look at what some of the primary sources of uncertainty are. Certainly model formulation is one of them. The retrospective misestimation is something that gives us a lot of concerns. I said parameter estimation and the harvest projections, those are kind of a bit of a hierarchy of where the error or the uncertainty lies in this. And we move into apportionment, and it introduces a subsequent suite of uncertainties. What we've tried to do this year, though, is Stephen has matched the input data to how the output data is used in apportionment. So in going through the weighting and adjustment processes for the input data into the assessment, that at least is bookended correctly the way we think it should be. The assessment presentation that Stephen just went through included both the structural uncertainty and then some measures of statistical uncertainty around the apportionment process, although as he noted, that was a very ad hoc process that we went through here. There are uncertainties associated with WPUE as well as with the adjustment procedures as well. We're going to present some measures of realized harvest rates that result from making a particular choice on the catch limit recommendations or CLRs under one harvest rate assumption versus those that you get when the correct estimate of eBio is obscured by the footer at the bottom of the slide, but where the estimate of eBio is actually coming from a misestimation from retrospective problems or an alternate model. So just following on from what Stephen said, we went through the process of looking at how to recommend the correct model. In this case, we chose the Wobble SQ because it's statistically the best model fit, and because the trend in several of the alternative models indicates that eBio is certainly closer to 260 than to the 280 level that we were seeing out of the 210 base model. We're getting that kind of direction from some of the other models, although they're not necessarily a good fit. And this gets into the whole issue of as I think Juan phrased it in here, is if you're precisely wrong or vaguely right in there, and that's sort of the error around some of these things. The retrospective issues continue to be evident in the biomass estimation. Juan is going to be having a paper in the RAW looking at several approaches to addressing this effect on the harvest projections. There's a couple of different ways to look at this. The effect on them in terms of the end product is essentially the same, but they involve either reducing the estimated biomass that comes out of the current assessment to account for future misestimation, or to change the target harvest rate on the currently estimated eBio to account for that misestimation in the future. We haven't really decided on the one that we'd like to focus on here. We think that We'd like to look at this a bit more in 2012. For this year, we implemented one example of this is using the adjusted harvest rate approach to develop the catch limits, incorporating some adjustments for the retrospective misestimation. And to give you an idea of what that means, if our current harvest rates, depending on area, are say 0.215 to 0.131 for areas 2A to 3A, and 0.215 and then 161 for areas 3B to 4, those estimates would drop from 0.215 to 0.131 for areas 2A to 3, and from 0.161 to 0.098 for areas 3B to 4. So a really significant shift in the harvest rates that will be associated with that kind of retrospective correction. For the apportionment process, we chose the, as we have done in the past several years, chose the 0 to 400 depth range as the basis for the apportionment because it incorporates the active commercial fishing area. But we recognize that both of the alternatives, either using 25 to 275 or 0 to 400, have potential for bias. Now, we proposed some research to address the biases by putting sampling into the 0 to 400 area, but that's going to be subject to funding, and it is a fairly expensive issue, as I've outlined for you before. We continue to use the hook competition and survey timing adjustment factors, the WPUE and the Coleman averaging over this. And again, we recommend that we actually go with the output of the assessment and essentially the slow up, full down harvest control rules. So there's a number of arguments for and against steeper cuts than we're getting out of the recommended catch limits you'll see in a second. And it is a pretty active debate within the staff right now. The WPUE and arguments in favor of going into deeper cuts than we're presenting to you is that the WPUE is only 34% of the 1997 to 1999 on average, and the removals are at about 60% of that. With the biggest cuts in the areas, one of the things that indicates that bigger cuts will have an effect is the areas with the biggest cuts have had the best match and relative reduction in the indices. The retrospective behavior of the model may not lessen, and therefore the recent harvest rates have been and will continue to be too high. The eBio estimates from the NIMS trawl surveys also show a strong decline. That's not necessarily directly related to the retrospective, but they're showing a decline as well as we're seeing in our indices. And the situation could get worse if the cuts are delayed. Alternatively, we've had a coastwide decline in WPUE of about 5% this year. Last year it was around 15%, still, again, consistent with the overall decline. And it's kind of difficult to equate a 50% cut in catch limits to that kind of recent performance of the stock. In 2011, the total removals were at the lowest level since 1984, and the commercial catch is the lowest since 1983. The proposed catch limit recommendations are another 10 million pounds lower than that, and the fishery CEY will be brought down by about 55% in 10 years. The alternative harvest rates would set the fishery CEYs another 28% lower than that, and that'd be the lowest level since 1935. The retrospective behavior may not continue. I mean, that's something that is the goal, to try and solve that issue. I think one of the other things that we have experienced collectively over the last several years is we're going to go through some major shift in policy. It really requires some broader consideration, and what we're saying to you is that we're kind of serving notice to you this year that this is a policy shift you should be thinking about. It's something we're trying to work on to solve as an issue, but the persistence of this issue means that you need to be thinking in this direction. It might be more reasonable to sort of phase in these cuts. It's not the first time that the Commission would have taken that sort of approach to things. In fact, the sort of slow up, fast down was kind of a codification of what the Commission used to do. Yes, Jim?
Before you go to the numbers, which
Yeah.
I know soon I wanted to talk about this, but
Yeah,
I didn't mean to cut off you if you got more.
No, that's I was sort of finished.
So up at the top, second arrow, areas with the biggest cuts have best match and relative reduction in indices. Now, why did we cut Area 2 more than the others? We didn't say Area 2 is going to be our poster child for how we're going forward. And so what was our rationale for not making bigger cuts elsewhere, or is this a sequencing thing where if all of a sudden we weren't discovering these new things, which you put up here, would we be making those big cuts in 3 this year?
No. The cuts in Area 2 were largely as a result of the pit tagging analysis and the ongoing migration issue, where the exploitation rates in Area 2 had been much too high because we were overestimating the biomass in the area because we weren't accounting for migration. So that was why all the push was to get the exploitation rates down in Area 2.
I mean, I think the answer is that it has to do with the way apportionment was implemented.
I don't believe that's the case. I think what we're saying is that we had a recognition based on the migration that the exploitation rates were the biomass was overestimated in Area 2, and that's why, because we were overestimating biomass, setting catch limits too high, which was why the exploitation rates were too high. Now, I think what you might be saying is that that's conditioned on the coastwide model and apportionment being correct.
I mean, we reduced those at the time that we implemented the coastwide model.
I think it's cause and effect. We reduced those when we implemented the coastwide model. That was the sort of window on that misestimation in Area 2.
But we weren't reducing those areas prior to implementation of the coastwide model.
Right, because the coastwide model was a result of understanding of
So
ongoing movement.
it had to do with the change in interpretation of what was going on, which was related to implementation of the coastwide model.
Right.
And the way that the apportionment was then estimated.
Yes. Is there more?
No.
No?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and that was a result of understanding that there was a net donor movement over into the eastern side of the stock. So, and that resulted in misestimation. We had to back off from that and say, what's the correct way, or what's a better way to do estimation for that area?
Okay, so with that explanation, why would that be a reason to make steeper than expected than whatever cuts in 3 or 4? Because I think you just said we did it in 2 because we had data that showed we had the wrong estimates. We don't have that data, so I don't see that. Maybe we need steeper cuts, but I don't see that as a reason why you would make steeper cuts than comes out of the model in other areas.
If I can speak to this, I believe the rationale to and this is sort of a composite of various staff views in this, but the rationale for this is that when we made deep cuts in the face of what we saw was declining resource or high exploitation rates, we saw a response. We have still declining biomass in particular in areas 3B and 4. And the argument is that, well, cuts work, we'll just turn that around.
Okay.
Bruce, I note that this is the first year I've ever heard that the staff suggests possibly responding to the retrospective issue.
Yeah.
And you mentioned there's 2 ways. Either you can reduce the estimated bio, I guess following the pattern of what we've seen in the past,
Correct.
how much it's gradually
Correct.
reduced over the years. And the other is to reduce the target harvest rate.
Right.
But just from last year to this, it looks like we were off on our eBio by about 10%. From 318 down to 282 or 282?
That's actually it's from the 292 to 245. Thanks, Stephen. Yeah.
And
It's actually worse than that, because it was 318 was the original estimate.
yeah.
With the updated data, but then it was 292, then it was 245.
So the actual potential retrospective in there is the 292 to 245.
And these
Sorry, was that with the same model run, or was that a flip of? Because last year we used base, and this year you're
I
saying.
think that's what the flip the model.
No,
changed.
that's just for the base model.
Okay.
That's how they sent the base model.
So the base model with current year's data, with the trendless model.
Or is, yeah,
Is
so
it 245
beginning
now?
year 2011, 245.
Okay, that's a lot more than I thought. Because I was looking at these harvest rate reductions you suggested, the 0.215 to 0.161, and the 0.161 down to 0.098, which is 20 to 30% or more reduction in harvest rate. I was wondering what what I looked at as a 10% reduction.
Yeah, no, it's more than that. Yeah. Here we go. Okay.
So,
Yes, go
well,
ahead.
just one issue on this that I think we'll have to not necessarily discuss today, but I just want to flag is I think that I'm just trying to understand what's a policy choice here versus the scientific advice, and because there's a little bit of both sort of going on right now, and I think we'll have to. I mean, you're trying to provide us, I think, with your best scientific estimate, but there's also some policy decisions or implementation here that we need to sort of think about. So I'm actually a little confused about whether we've got both of those sort of combined in what you're presenting, and I'm just having a little trouble teasing out which is the science based on all this uncertainty versus some kind of policy choices. So I think just flagging that I think we'll have to give that a little bit of consideration.
Okay. This is the sort of traditional table, and I'm going to go through this one and the next table in fairly quick order because I want to get to the third table because it's the nub of the issue. This is the staff catch limit recommendations for 2012 based on current harvest rates. So again, this is the traditional table looking what the total CEY is, what the other removals are, and again, these other removals change somewhat depending on the target biomass because of changes in the GHL in Area 2C and Area 3A. Then from that comes the fishery CEY, and then for comparison what the 2011 catch limit was and then the recommended level for 2012. And the direct comparison is 41 to 33 in terms of total catch limit recommendations between these. And this is again looking at it from the perspective of current harvest rates that we've been using over the last several years. If we look at this in terms of adjusting the harvest rates to deal with a retrospective issue, and there's a number of assumptions that are built into this as there is into the previous slide as well. This is assuming that the retrospective problem continues and that it's going to be down on the order of 40-some-odd% over a 5-year period. This is the kind of catch limits that would result if you apply the harvest rates that way I identified in the previous slide to this thing. So we're talking about a jump from 41 million pounds as a coastline limit to 15 million pounds. This is a fairly significant step, obviously. So this is looking at the two issues and the staff recommendations. Looking at the present harvest rates, we're still looking at a fairly significant reduction from 2011 catch limits of 41 million pounds down to 33 million pounds. The reductions are visited virtually on all areas except Area 2A and Area 2C, which had some significant positive responses in indices this year. At the bottom of the table there, you'll see a thing that says realized harvest rates. And what this is an attempt to convey to you the issue of what the realized harvest rate would be under the two scenarios. So looking at the first line, it says that if the current harvest rate is correct under the yellow column, that says if these harvest rates of 0.215 and 0.161 are correct, then the realized harvest rate coastwide would be about 0.19. However, if the alternative harvest rates of 0.131 and 0.098 are correct, then the adjusted harvest rate would be about 0.28. And shifting over into the blue column, you see the opposite occurs. The realized harvest rates, if the current harvest rates are correct and we had numbers down in the 15 million pound range, would be coastwide around 0.12, and the opposite is true if those numbers are correct, and we'd have numbers around 0.18. So this is kind of the nub of the issue right now. The retrospective problem is giving us a fair amount of angst. It hasn't gone away. It varies somewhat in intensity, but we have, and you'll see Juan has prepared a paper for this for our RARA, that it has been a persistent issue here, and it's not something that has so far gone away. So what we're telling you is that if this does not go away and if things carry on exactly the way they are right now, if there's no management response, if there's no change in dynamics of stock or so forth, then the misestimation could be of the level here of 0.19 to 0.28.
Bruce?
Yeah.
Two questions. First, using the current model, what we've used, what would these numbers, is there a table on that? Have you?
I have this one. You're talking about the base 210?
Yeah.
I've got it in actual catch limits. Yes, here we are. No, sorry, this is just realized harvest rates. I don't think I have actual catch limits on this. So,
What, would it be on the, I mean, if wobble is in the neighborhood of 33 million, what would the base be?
because that estimate is 280, was it? Have you? Okay.
My presentation.
Yeah.
Not as nice in format, but I can provide you the numbers.
Yeah. Do you want to see it?
Oh,
base- well,
tomorrow's fine.
Yeah, I guess.
So, and then my other question is, when we went from Cajun to the current model.
Yeah.
Do you consider this as dramatic a change going from the current model to wobble?
No. No, that's a pretty subtle difference between the base 210 and the wobble SQ. It's pretty
And
subtle.
if they're pretty close and they're pretty subtle, that's why I'd like to see the poundage numbers.
Well, it's,
Why
you know,
would we make a change?
Yeah, if we, and that's a fair question, and it gets back to the question Laura asked her as well. She was sort of saying that, the delta AICs were pretty close. Well, that's a log scale. The delta AICs of 20 is a pretty significant difference in fits between these things. As Stephen was trying to point out, 1 to 2 to 4 type thing is okay. They're roughly equivalent type thing. When you're up in sort of in the 20 range, those are significantly different. And from our perspective, we need to have some standard by which we're going to gauge how well we're estimating the E-bio. And that's the standard that we're using, is the statistical fit to the data.
I'd be real interested in seeing what the numbers would be
Yeah.
using last year's.
And as I say, Stephen has those. We obviously worked up the numbers for all of them.
Do you think they're more or less than the wobbled 33 million?
They're more, because it's based on a higher E-bio.
But the difference was 260 to 280.
Yeah, yeah.
That premise model came out with an implied E-bio of 280.
It's
288, actually, 288.
288, yeah. The way that the harvest rates are applied on here, it's kind of a kludgeon way, because what we're looking at here is applying different harvest rates to the 260 E-bio. It implies that the E-bio is actually about 173 instead of 260 when you actually look at it. So if you were using the sort of correct E-bio and the current harvest rates, which is what we've done the harvest rate evaluation on, then it would be saying biomass around 173.
And then conversely, what would 2011's catch look like if you used the wobble?
I'm sorry, drag that by again.
If you use the wobble SQ last year, what would the poundage numbers look like?
We haven't got that in front of us. Stephen was asked that question a little earlier, and he did fit all of the models last year to it. I don't recall. Stephen, do you recall?
I can tell you, last year, the action number was 318. That was the trendless. Wobble SQ number was 295. But, again, the 318 became 292, and I get the data to 295 and become 280 something lower, but it's on the order of 10% lower, all of these equal.
So actually fairly consistent with this year.
Yeah, just in general, one thing I'm having trouble coming to grips with is these big proposed reductions at the time when we've just talked that the biomass is at, a relative high. And so it's got to do with all these small fish, but at the same time, we're looking at a spawning stock, biomass to spawning stock ratio of about, you said B43.
Yeah.
So I guess the question.
If I could just stop for a second, that's B43 as we estimate it currently. If the retrospective patterns here, it wouldn't be necessarily B43.
Right, well, I just went back and checked last year's, and last year we were also estimating B33, and I can see that our current estimate of what it was last year was quite a bit less than that.
Yeah.
So maybe we're sort of there. But what I don't have a sense how good is B43 or B. We haven't really talked, I don't think, precisely about the targets in that space, or is that biomass reference points. as there have been more formally in some other assessments, to know whether, B43 is actually good relative or bad relative to a target. But
Well, relative to our threshold points, it's our threshold reference point, it's good. I think that the issue that the staff is raising right now is that that may not be what the biomass is. And if we could look at the retrospective pattern we have seen out of the stock,
Yeah.
the argument is that it's not.
But the retrospective division down to the spawn biomass is not as great as the EVA is true.
okay,
And the reference points are on. The reference points are on spawning biomass, Steve?
yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
Speed of the seed model is not the same number.
Yes, Philip?
Yeah, the column there for the retrospective misestimation, I guess you can say it's serious enough to list in public here. That's a pretty drastic reduction in the catch limits. And so are you saying this is where we're going to go next year, or?
I think
more
it's,
than likely, since they're showing it here obviously in public, so it must be.
we're showing it in public because it's of sufficient concern to us that we're highlighting it to you. I won't say that we have unanimity scientifically on whether or not that's exactly correct and whether or not we can avoid going in that direction in terms of trying to solve the retrospective problem, but we haven't done that so far. So I think it's worthwhile pointing out to you the reality that in using our assessment models the way we are consistently overestimating biomass given the recent performance of it.
As a commercial fisherman, that's quite surprising news, or like dropping a bomb almost. But,
Yeah, surprising is a pretty mild word for it, I think.
yeah, trying to find the right word to say in public.
I don't think they exist, though.
Okay.
Yes, Rebecca, yeah.
So, from what I understand, we've gone to a lot of trouble, or Stephen has, others, to try a bunch of models, do a bunch of runs, see what the best fit is, come up with your recommended model based on statistical analysis, and then compare it against kind of reality, which is the retrospective analysis. And essentially you're saying your model, there's a big gap between what your model is saying and what the retrospective analysis is saying. And so your fix for that is essentially to just kind of clunk and make a major adjustment. Is that right?
No, I guess what, we're not, as you can see from the columns, we're not recommending that you do that right now, and one of the approaches, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, but I'm not, and I know you're not recommending you putting that there, but essentially the blue column, that's what it's doing, is it's making this massive adjustment because the model doesn't fit the data, is that right?
Well, in fact, the model fits the data pretty well, but not, as you add more observations to it, it revises its estimate for it. But in terms of, say, to make it fit the data any better right now, we haven't come up with a better fix for that. There are no sort of, and that's what Stephen was trying to point out in the working group that NIPS is working over that. The question is there a diagnostic that says there's something wrong in here? And there isn't. At least there hasn't been developed so far.
Right, so Stephen went through kind of a list of things, possible reasons why there's a difference, a gap. One of them is uncalculated mortality with the
Right.
So that could be like catch monitoring as a result of catch monitoring,
Catch.
catch and that sort of thing. But presumably those types of errors have been in the time series forever, and so even if it's wrong, as you say, it's consistently wrong, I guess.
And if you recall from one of Stephen's plots there where he looked at sort of changes in parameterization within a given model, sort of putting double the bycatch in there, which pops the biomass estimate up on things. But in order to deal with a retrospective problem, you would want to think there's a trend in that in some fashion.
And I guess perhaps I just may not understand the now, but the thing I don't understand is there's a whole bunch of trouble to come up with the best model we could, and then you compare it to the retrospective, there's a big gap. And so,
But that's
I
the
don't
case for
understand how
all
the
the
model
models.
works.
Well, that's the case for all of the models. The retrospective pattern's there for all of them.
Yeah.
It was there with Cajun.
It was there with Cajun. Different one though. Actually, it was we were on the good side in Cajun. We were consistently underestimating biomass, which is not atypical for trajectories in the stock. You know, it simply may be that it's an endemic feature of these kinds of models that when the stock is on a particular trajectory, you have a retrospective pattern one way and it flips over when you go the other way. Stephen, do you have any more comments on that?
Well, I really think the signatures people got lucky. You know, they had problems of the magnitude, and they ended up dropping one of their indices, and problem went away. You know, there was no expectation of that. Somebody said, don't use this one-time series, and they didn't. And now, there's some little bit going on still with that, but for the most part, though, their things simply went away. It was cured. I think the assessment document said it was cured.
So,
Nice benefit of that.
that there's here, in one situation, I'm just wondering, like, with the model, is there any value in saying, well, maybe the model itself needs a fundamental rethink, or, as you told me before, models and models, and there's no really kind of.
I'll ask Stephen to respond to that. You know, that's his neighborhood.
You know, the reason that I've worked with this, you know, we get a lot of criticism for changing things. You know, don't change things. We'll stay the course, do stuff. Well, this model, I agree, it's not perfect. No model ever is. But this model was developed over a number of years. It was reviewed by the CIE folks, as was the harvest policy that goes with it. And I would be remiss to suddenly change things. I mean, within the context of what I think this model was accepted for, I'm tweaking it and testing it and doing what I can with it. And maybe that it's data. That the problem, I can't find anything in the model. So next thing I try is data. We have a lot. I mean, the amount of computer code that goes into preparing the data is like 10 times what the assessment model is. I mean, that's a huge amount of work preparing the data. So that's where you go next. But the justification of this model's been reviewed. It was accepted. It was reviewed. And that's why we're working with this.
Okay, but just next pose a question, I apologize for my perhaps not precise language, but it seems to me that, okay, I get that, it's the best model, you've done a lot of work and it's the model, and you're right, I think changing the model every year is problematic. But it seems to me that you've got the model, you're defending it, and I'm fine with that. But then you do this kind of comparative retrospective analysis, say there's a problem, and then make this big adjustment, which seemingly to me, without any real kind of basis for that. I mean, I understand that the gap, you're trying to close the gap, but the way you close the gap is, I guess, based on what? Based on like the sum of the difference between the two results. Like,
You're going to see a presentation tomorrow. This is actually Juan's work, and he'll certainly be speaking to it tomorrow. I mean, it could be today, I suppose.
I guess that's the thing for me, like to understand the difference between the two, the yellow and the blue. It's like, well, how'd you get there unless you just
Essentially, it's exactly what you phrased it. It's trying to close the gap. Saying how would you change the harvest rate so that gap was closed.
Put in words, it says that over the past 5 years, the difference between the initial estimate of eBio and the settled value has been a drop of about 40%. So all I'm doing is taking that drop, so assume whatever number you've got now, drop it by 40%, that's where it would settle out at. It's assuming the same level of reduction over the next 5 years, that whatever number we have now, it thinks it's exactly the same, but that's the reduction you get.
Yeah, it just seems kind of funny to me that you go through all this, to me, seemingly complicated, high-level thinking in mathematics, and then at the end you just kind of go down and make this big adjustment, and that's the part I don't understand.
I understand. I mean, it is a fix.
Yeah.
It's not a cure for the problem. It's treating the symptom, not curing the problem.
Yeah, but I just wonder, well, I guess you'd have to see over time, like, whether the cure is the same every year. Otherwise, it's just kind of making the model fit the data rather than the model really working.
Well, we're constantly on the hunt to try and find the best way to do this. And as Rebecca and I were talking yesterday, one of the things we have proposed in our research plan for next year is to have a small contract to have our assessment coded up in a different model, just to see if it makes any difference. It's coded up in stock synthesis, for example, which is one of the common models used in the NIMS assessments, just to see if it makes makes a difference. I think it's kind of a validation process that you sort of, it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, one of the things I think I was going to bring up more in the context of the research was just, I appreciate that there's been a lot of work on this, but it was a while since we reviewed it. There's been a little bit new thinking out there in the community, and just it'd be good just to make sure that, or perhaps it would be time to have it reviewed again in the context of, are we, certainly, 5 years ago, we were right at the top in terms of the state of the art, but, has the field shifted, and there's a bit more we need to do to get to the state of the art again. I'm not that familiar right now with the current state, but it's just a question I think I'd like just to pose, because we certainly do appreciate the work that's gone into this, and I think we do want to make sure that we stay on top of it to the extent that we can. Certainly there's been a lot of thinking in terms of Bayesian approaches, for example, that would then lead to some ways of incorporating some of this information on uncertainty we're just looking at. So, is that something we could be considering?
Well, it sounds like we're going to get more information tomorrow to help put another piece in the puzzle.
Yeah, in terms of this overall, I am intuitively having a little bit of trouble because, as you said, there were some areas where things seem to have leveled off or are looking better, and we're still recommending some reductions. The proportionally may be less.
Yeah.
Or,
in fact, there's
yeah,
a slight
it's an increase in
2C.
2C. But, they had a huge decrease last year. If we looked where they were, say, 2 years ago relative.
2C had significant.
So, last year, or this current fishing year, they had a significant cut. So if we had sort of prorated, if we went back 2 years and then looking at what you've got here, it's probably not quite sure how that relates similar to the other.
We're still well over 2 years. Yeah.
So what I'm thinking is that 2C had this huge cut last year, and with these reductions, it's the level of cuts in different areas perhaps have leveled off a bit. I'm not trying to recall those numbers in my mind, just looking at the overall reductions. They sort of even back out a bit, I guess is what I'm thinking here. But maybe I may be mistaken.
I'm not sure I'm following that.
Okay, it's not important. Just trying to.
Which the only way a stock can grow is through recruitment and growth, right? So has the staff looked at all at how much the decrease in the growth rate could have affected what our harvest rate should be? Decrease. I mean, we've still got recruitment, but the growth rate is less than half of what it used to be. So how much?
Stephen, you got.
How much did that affect commercial harvest rate or total lose? In times of good growth, you could harvest at 25% or 20%. How much should you?
No, that's not actually the case. I mean, your harvest rate is set up according to the population dynamics of the animal, and if it grows farther, you get greater yield, but you don't harvest harder.
We are still operating under a harvest strategy that I helped develop, first implemented 7 or 6 years ago, where the understanding at the time of the dynamics of the stock, so Bill Clark and I did, where we looked at things that influenced recruitment and looked at growth and looked at sort of a harvest strategy that would get you through lean times and good times, sort of how frequently you would, and that's why we had the reference points of B30 and B20. We looked at either density-dependent responses in growth, so you fish them down, they get bigger, or what we called sort of new status quo, where the size at age is just this and it's small. Well, that was, quite a bit bigger than it is now, but at that time. So we developed a harvest policy to deal with both manners of variability. The harvest policy is being actively re-examined or revamped. Juan, again, will have a bit of a presentation on that tomorrow, taking a little bit of a different approach. And it's certainly time to redo the harvest policy as well. And that's work in progress. But at the time that we developed the harvest policy, though, it did factor in the potential for things to not change, not getting better. I didn't actually look at growth or size at age getting even smaller. We just, at that point, we said, oh, they can't possibly get any smaller than this. They did, so that's where we are with that.
What percent of the biomass, if we thought about something like taking off the size limit, what percent of the biomass would be, what would that do to the exploitable biomass given current selectivity patterns?
That's a good question, and we had intended to have a full size limit analysis for you, but it's very, very complicated analysis, and it's driven entirely by assumptions of how you model the work. We have no data. I mean, we have to make up what would happen. We have to guess, and so we try to make a range of things, but there's other effects of how growth would respond to your harvesting at different levels, and so we don't know. Without data, we can only guess what the selectivity would be. The one thing we can do, and we've done it a number of times, Anna Parma did it 20 years ago, I did it 10 years ago, Juan did it this year, was compare if you had a commercial fishery as is, the only other contrast we have data for is our survey. And say, okay, all of a sudden, new selectivity pattern is what's in our survey. And that doesn't provide evidence that it's worth changing the size limit. That's comparing the extremes, saying current size limit, no size limit. The difficulty is interpolating between these two.
Do you have any, maybe one thing that might be worth looking at would be the percent or the biomass from the survey that's, say, between 26 and 32, or what's the trend of that over time?
Well, I do have plots of what we're catching, of the catch of fish, of U32 fish, and I mean, we don't get that many below 26. I mean, we get them down to not much, but there's not been a big increase. Some areas have shown 3A and 3B have shown pretty sizable increases. Right, but that's numbers in the catch. It's not really any biomass. So.
But that's the only window we've got on this is from the survey.
Probably
Yeah.
it would be more useful to use the NIMS trawl survey because that's.
Well, I'm just trying to rationalize the fact that we've still got total biomass going up, and I'm just trying to make sense of that piece and wondering what's going on in that section. Is it that everything is really close to 32 and we're getting a big bulge there, which might give me a different sense in terms of the overall risk for going forward?
It's like a good bush type thing. I'm not being sarcastic. I'm just saying, but that's sort of saying, what's likely to be coming, and do we sort of have, it's almost like tactical harvest rate adjustment.
Well, I mean, if all the biomass is below 26, if that's where the bulk of the biomass is, then I'd be way more concerned than I would be if there's a big chunk of it that's just around just under 32.
Our ability to analyze that, it's just as Steve said, it's going to be driven largely by the assumption of selectivity that is actually visited on that by the commercial risk.
I actually do plot out the NIMS distribution of. They provide estimates of total biomass by length. And actually, I have the plots, and you can see it. I get lots of plots that show them group them by 10-centimeter intervals. I probably should do it a bit finer. And it could show you at least for 3A, 3B, 4A, well, all from area 3 all the way up to the Bering Sea. I could certainly look at the trawl swept estimates of abundance at length and provide that.
If we use even as incomplete as it is, if we use from the survey the sort of trend in U32, numbers on the survey, they're very, very slow increase in most areas. It's not like they've sort of.
But I guess using some assumptions, the model, the stock assessment model should be able to predict that. I mean, you could calculate that from the model outputs, whether it's what that.
Sure. Because you have the full population matrix of numbers at age and mean
Yeah.
size at age. Well, that's Bruce's last slide. I have a number of questions in my mind, but none I am prepared to frame at the moment, I guess. And so perhaps it's a good time to remind the 100 or so people on the webinar and the people in the room that this is not the start of the process. There's been all kinds of work done, but it's also not the end of the process. So these things will be looked at, and we'll in January at the annual meeting make the final decisions.
I'm suspecting there's going to be work in between this one.
Yeah. So with that, what was your expectation for continued presentations today versus tomorrow? Or?
You know, we could have Juan do his presentation on the retrospective issue.
What's the pleasure?
So you prepared to do that? Yeah, we can do that now. If that's your pleasure.
I have 5 minutes before. Probably we'd have an hour if we wanted to spend it on that instead of get a head start on tomorrow's work.
Okay.
I think yes.
Yeah. So are you going to have to use yours? You got it up here? Okay.
We take a 5-minute break?
Yeah, 5-minute break. So we'll start again at 4.
Okay.
Ken.
We will still be on the webinar for those folks there. Yeah. It is, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
If those guys count catches of halibut like they count salmon, they'll be doing fine. Because they'll be looking at numbers of fish, right?
Well, it seems to me that's what we need to do.
Hey, you guys that catch goals like they said, salmon, you doing fine.
I just told somebody one day, I said, if you took one of those salmon stock and brought it into the package,
Start working on population. The other thing too, the nice thing about it is that go slow. What do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? Leave these soybeans out there to feed them? What do you want me to do? Bring soybeans and feed them or what? You know? But it's a fact of nature. Exactly, but in a second, if you're not in there, usually bye, and if we measure catches, like we measure catches at 10, we'll be okay.
see an acre on the
Maybe we need to have extermination fishery.
all of area 2 is basically all of area 2 is basically covered.
Yeah, well,
A lot
that's,
more stable than the cover.
well, that's what I'm looking at.
I
So
can't see,
we're
I can't see
going
to the blue line. Blue line.
No, but we're proposing these big cuts when it seems to be recovering and stable.
Yeah.
That's, I know. The percent share is not percent share. Yeah, it was like 12 points last year. Oh, great.
I think we're like,
Okay.
no, it's exposed.
Is the one we saw last year.
Dr. Valero.
Hello. So this presentation is a companion presentation to a prior document for this year, and addresses a number of harvest policy considerations. In this case, in particular, to what has been discussed earlier regarding the pattern of the retrospective issue and potential ways of factoring that into the current harvest policy. So this slide shows the history of target harvest rate from 1984 to effectively this year. And several things has to be noted is that although we do not have currently a formal coast-wide harvest rate, the reality of the development of the target harvest rate was thought or developed from the one that we have now from what was considered the core area of the stock. Now the actual target, if you will, coast-wide harvest rate is a combination of the target harvest rates that we have for areas 3A East and 3A West. And why that happened is what I'm going to explain in a second. If we just focus on the overall target harvest rate, the one that was developed by the harvest policy at different times, has come down from a high in the 80s and early 90s of 35% of explorable biomass. At that time, they were using a different estimate of natural mortality, and it was brought down in part to changes in natural mortality and other considerations regarding the assessment. A change that happened in 2006 was that some areas, including 4B and 4CDE, were considered area of specific concern, and this was based on changes in indices of those areas, particularly the survey and changes in age composition, for example, and that resulted in a reduction from 0.2 to 0.15. In 2008, 4A joined the set of areas of concern, and the same reduction of 0.15 was determined for 4A. And 2010, the area 3B also joined the set of areas of particular concern, and the reduction into 0.15 target harvest rate. Beginning this year, although this seems like an increase in target harvest rate, that is not so, because effectively that was a different way of factoring the fraction that is over 26 inches and under 32 inches. So effectively, the target harvest rate is equivalent. We just redefine what the explorable biomass is. In terms of where we are with the most current estimates of coastwide realized harvest rates compared with what the targets were, or what the implied target is, because now it's no longer 0.2 coastwide, now it's a combination of that 0.2 and the 0.15, which is basically typically around 0.19, 0.18 each year. Irrespectively of that slight difference regarding what is the target harvest rate, we can see that we've been overshooting that target in some of the years by as much as, in this case, will be around 50% of what the target was, 0.2. In this case, I think it's like 0.32. We're going to get to specific numbers in the next sets of slides. A couple of points to make very clear here is that given the retrospective pattern, the estimates of how big is that departure changes from year to year. That is, when we set quotas, we believe we're setting them close to the target, and then when the original biomass gets revised down, the catch is already taken, so that number does not change. We're just dividing by a number that is smaller. So this is going up, has been going up each year. By that metric, the earlier estimates of realized harvest rates are the ones that are more imprecisely estimated, and the ones that are expected to change more into the future.
So can I ask a question?
Yes.
So if the retrospective thing continues, and we try to produce this chart next year, will those realized harvest rates be higher than they show here?
Well, it's hard to know what is going to happen next year, but what we can say is what has been happening since 2004, and each year has been consistently down. So if we were to bet on what happened next year based on what happened in the past 8 years, somebody can say, well, yes, that would be the case, but we don't know if the pattern will continue. If we continue to do the same things that we've been doing in the past, and the pattern continues, it is expected that those harvest rates will be revised upwards. Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks.
So the previous slide was in terms of departures between realized harvest rates estimated from this year and target harvest rates at the coast-wide scale. This is other departures from realized harvest rates and target harvest rates at the area-specific level. So this column here that says CW is coast-wide, and is the same series that you saw in the previous slide that was in white bars in that case. So this goes from 1997 to last year, 2010. And it shows that pattern that we were saying before. Coast-wide, the target is somewhere, the implied target, if you will, close to around 0.19, and for some years it has been higher. these are all the other areas with the respective target harvest rate. So point to note, as was mentioned in previous presentations, particularly in area 2, there has been a large departure between realized harvest rates and target, and we can see after this is the last year of the closed area assessments and after the implementation of the coast-wide assessment with solid partition of biomass, we see decline of realized harvest rates for a particular assessment, right? Because these numbers get revised up every year. So things like this have been revised up every year, at least since 2004. Why we have 2 panels here is just one without adjustments on the survey, and this one is with adjusting for hook competition and survey timing. So this is as far as I will discuss regarding area-specific departures. The focus of the presentation is on the coast-wide total. So this,
Can you go back to that a minute? Because I had, maybe I'm just having trouble, I think I'm just having trouble, it's okay, having trouble reading that last bar. Because it's looking like everything isn't behaving the same way, but maybe it's just, I'm having trouble seeing the colors.
yeah, it's a lot of data in that. We have used a different color pattern for the last few years.
Between 2B and 2A, like 2B is going down year by year, but 2A is up.
Yeah, I have a question, Philip.
Yep.
Without adjustments and adjusting for hook competition and survey timing, I don't understand as far as to the stock is concerned, and the big reductions that are recommended right now, or the cuts. The adjustments, without the adjustments, would the cuts be less or more than staff recommendations right now? Or are the staff recommendations lower because of the hook competition and survey timing?
The point of this is actually to show that although you may see some differences in an area by area departure, say between target and realized, that happens only within areas for a particular year. So the adjustments have no effect, no discerning effect in the overall cost-wide trend in departures between target and realized harvest rates. So that is actually not factored in the analysis. It's only focusing at the cost-wide level. So the adjustment will not influence to measure this type of proposal or alternative adjusting the target harvest rate.
I think when we've looked at these in past years, and I recall that in British Columbia in 2B, the peak used to be 60%, but these have been adjusted up now because of the retrospective behavior, right? And so these might even come up slightly more to that peak here. It's over 70% there.
If the pattern of retrospective, the retrospective issues is still present, say this year, it is expected that it will be there, that departure will be similar to what we see now.
But they start to converge. They start to converge after,
We'll see.
things. So
We'll see some spikes.
I don't know. I guess my point is I don't know if those particular ones, the peaks would change that much. The farther they are in the past, the less they're going to adjust. Right.
In theory, that's what you're expecting. Effectively, is when you have the whole dynamics of this is that when you have only one look at an incoming cohort, you only have a single look, and they're very selected to your year. The next year you have 2 look at it. The following year you have 3. So the farther on you go, the better look you had at cohorts that are entering, and overall the combination to the exploitable biomass. Since we have a broad set of ages in a long-lived fish, then it takes quite a few years to actually allow to have the look, if you will, to the real magnitude of that cohort, the close we can get. This is the retrospective pattern as of last year assessment, so end of 2010. And what this plot is showing on the upper panel is the differing trends of explorable biomass as estimated from the first assessment that I'm showing here is the assessment of 2006. The pattern has been going in this consistency since 2004. And this is slightly different from what was presented in Stephen's presentation, in as much this is the real time series of estimates that were produced in 2006. So there are two ways of looking at retrospective patterns. One is the historical one, which is this one. The other one is the sequential, which just is the last year's assessment, and you drop 1 year of data. So they produce slightly different results. This is basically where we set quotas at in 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, so forth. What we see as solid lines here is the estimate up to the last year of assessment. What we see as dotted lines here are the 5-year projections that were done in this year. So we see that each year, subsequently, the initial biomass that was estimated, say for the year where we said catches, it gets revised down. As Stephen mentioned, there was a year there between 2007 and 2008 where the reduction was not so much, and actually the time series of estimates overlap with the previous ones. However, the pattern came back as of the end of last year. This was the estimate that we have not only of the last year, but all of the previous years, and the 5-year biomass projections with some of the statistical uncertainty that was mentioned earlier. In this case, statistical uncertainty regarding future recruitment.
So this is a year old, though, right?
This is a year old.
So if you take that bottom line, the last point is a projection, and where it turns there is probably 295 million pounds. But now we're hearing that it's probably 245.
We're going to see slides on that in the
Okay.
next slide.
Okay.
So this pattern is for the exportable biomass. That is the pattern for the exporting biomass.
But it looks like it's a lot tighter for the spawning biomass, or less of a retrospective pattern.
It is different on the last year, particularly it does not have that steep uptake in the estimates of the last year. And we're going to see the magnitude, I think, in the next panels.
Okay.
So this was as of end of last year.
Yeah.
This is with the updated numbers for this year. So the pattern is still the same in terms of the uptake in the last year or last few years, estimated uptake on it, and then the pattern of revised down biomass. As mentioned earlier, the last year's estimate of eBio was revised down as a whole 25%, but part of it is due to change in the input data regarding commercial CPUE. But effectively, we said the catches at a number that now came down 25%. Part due to retrospective pattern, part due to an updated data set.
But this is also using a different parameterization. We're using wobble SQ
No,
here.
I'm just using all the same base cases it was used last year for comparison. So we actually called the fish based on these numbers here, and this number here has not affected yet the dynamics of the stock. So it's still comparable as well. So the pattern is not only affecting the estimates of explorable biomass, in this case in triangles in blue, and spotty biomass as pink squares, but it's also affecting the estimates of total biomass. So we can take any of these years, they also come down, and those uptake can actually be downwards increase years down the road. Again, this is as of last year, this is as of this year, so it's the same pattern in trend, and depending on the year, it could be a larger decrease on the last year, so change from last year to this year. So it's difficult to look at these things other than the overall trend. So another way of looking at this problem is looking at the how that first look that we get at each explorable biomass, and that's where we set the quotas at, gets revised each subsequent year. For example, the assessment that was done in year 2004 produce a 2005 estimate of this number here, which is about 425 or so, no, more than that, 440 say. I mean, I want to be specific because I cannot read this graph to that scale. Respectively of that, the following year, 2005, it's revised down, so on and so forth until it gets somewhere to this level. So this has happened to every explorable estimate. This is 2005. The pattern has been consistent with some variability, as was mentioned before. So to put this in relative numbers, we can take the first estimate, which was the largest for all of this explorable biomass, and plot this in terms of a change relative to the initial estimate. So 1 is the first year that was estimated, and then this is like the fraction and percentage that has come down each year. So the 2005 estimate was revised down by 10% in 1 year. For example, this one was slightly less. It was the one in 2007 by 20%, and so on and so forth. So this is this year's estimate. If you want, we only looked at it once, so we can know what is going to happen. But then again, this is as of last year. So this year, that's the pattern that we see again. So as was mentioned before, you would expect that those declines at some point will converge. Basically, at some point we're going to say, well, we overestimate those explorable biomass by a number, and that's more or less fixed. Although we can see that some of the large changes in the first year, some of those estimates, it's not there in the last year in terms of the magnitude. For example, last year, this is a 25% coming down from the value that catches were set. In the last year, it's not 25, but overall, the pattern is still declining for, say, 2007. So it's not a steep here, but it's declining. Yes.
So the 2000, our understanding of the eBio on the grounds in 2004 continues to decline. So last year we thought it was at 68% of what we thought it was in 2004. This year we only think it's at 62%. So that's how to interpret that?
That is correct. So if we come back to last year, we can say we can be as low as 30% of one of the oldest estimates.
So that declining line slope doesn't seem to be changing that much. And if it's so next year we probably will be at 52% or whatever. But if that slope is staying the same, well, maybe I'm looking at I looked at the wrong line.
So that's the line. So
okay.
You can say there's no change in the slope between the second year that it was estimated and this last time. The first year was steeper than that one.
I see. I thought that was the continuation of the blue line. So I understand now. But my question was going to be, when we look at those patterns that show the whole year from 2004, it seems like they converge a little bit, so you have less of an impact each year. But this would seem to suggest that you have the same estimate of continuing decline, even of the old year classes of the old population. I probably haven't said that very well, but
no, what you're getting at is like these are expecting, if I can rephrase your point, you're expecting that these declines will at some point converge. However, for some of those cohorts, there's not an indication of convergence beyond the second year.
Yeah, and I guess my expectation that they might converge was because the very first slides you show with that series of lines, seems to me they converge, but maybe I just looked at that wrong.
This one?
No, it's back about 5 or 6. Those.
That one here?
Yes, because when you go back to, I see, so that's way back at 2000, so we no longer get any changes of what we believed was there in 2000. That has stabilized. But when we're looking at 2004, I can see that it's still dropping. Okay, thank you very much. I have that.
But it does tend to converge.
Well, I thought it would, but it surely doesn't seem to be converging in these slides. The slope's not changing.
Well, I think if you follow individual ones there is some variation.
So the first one can be the largest one. Like, for example, this year you drop 20%, and then you drop like about 4, another 5. I mean, it's hard to make things, but it's almost like 10% or 8% in the last year. So it all depends on how you read this thing. This line will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points. If you take one, you take this one out, this is the increase in slope or no slope. If you put that on, it's hard to know.
It would seem like that slope should get less and less.
Yes.
One would expect that it would come down to some lower limit that it couldn't go beyond. I mean, if the slope's not changing, then there's something wrong with the data because it can't get to 0.
The data.
I mean, the slope, I mean, if that continues into the future, those lines will get to 0, which is...
Well, they have a limit. We know that there was at least, it can't be 0 because there was at least the amount that we took.
It can't be 0 because I fished those years and there was fish there.
Exactly. But it's showing a decline, and as Bruce mentioned, it changes between years. However, at this stage, from my perspective, it's hard to predict this, for example, or any of the other ones as a converged series or anything along those lines. So we're not predicting here anything that will happen next year. It's just saying what we're last year and the previous years and where we are now.
Well, I'm with Gary. I think we can predict that line can't continue to go down at that rate.
Or there's something else that's involved.
Yeah.
So then, at any rate, the farthest it has dropped for so far is around 39% of the original estimate in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So this is not only affecting the trends on explorable biomass, total biomass, but also in spawning biomass. And this has an effect on the performance of our harvest policy regarding the reference points that we use. So just a quick reminder of what we're looking at. Here, this is the time series of explorable biomass estimated by this assessment. And in this case, this is for the base 2010, so not the wall, but it doesn't change much from it. This value here is the estimated the virgin explorable biomass, and then the 30% and 20%. Just a reminder of people, this area between the it's called between the threshold and fish level is you can call it the green area where we apply unmodified target harvest rates. The area that is in yellow there is an area of caution between the threshold and the limit. And the limit is an area where effectively following the current harvest control rule we will cease to fish or decrease the harvest rate to 0, following the current harvest control rule. So what this shows is that for 5 years, 5 consecutive years between 2005 and 2009, we have dropped below the threshold. So following those years into our harvest control rule, this is basically we compute each year where we are, we enter through here, we see in which area we are. If we're green, we apply the full target harvest rate. If we are yellow, we start to decrease our target harvest rate depending on which level we are. So if we map those years into our harvest control rule, had we known that we were down at that level, then the reduction in target harvest rates would have been in the order of 18.6% to 14%, which is the year, in this case 2007, that retrospectively you can see that we can estimate that we were at that level. Again, these estimates have been coming down from the previous figure, right? So it's not that at that year we thought we were, in this case, 26% of unfished. So that value, for example, the one from 2007, was estimated by the 2006 assessment as we being in, it should be SB, I apologize for the typo, in a 43% from unfished level. In fact, years later, now we estimate retrospectively that we estimate that we were lower. And that's the level we are estimating we are currently for 2002. So ways of dealing with this pattern, there are ways of them which are saying, do we treat the symptom or do we treat the malady or the cause of it? So one way is actually to fix the retrospective pattern in the assessment, and as it was pointed out earlier, it's a complicated thing to do. Another way is actually to factor this into the target harvest rate, so try to be proactive to the problem. So the first approach is to decrease the target harvest rate as a function of the consistent annual revision that we've seen for years past. So this was again based on last year's, and that is, if we assume that at least we've seen a reduction of 30%, then based on last year's data, we can apply a 30% revision down of the target harvest rates to account for the overestimation of those exploitable biomass as of last year. Using this year's results, we can see that we thought it was 30% last year. This year is down to 39% of the 39% lower than the original estimate, and that's if you adjust the target harvest rates down by the same amount, you get those values. It's important to note here that this is not a modification of the target harvest rates, but it's an adjustment so that we're actually getting closer to achieve those target harvest rates. Because applying those harvest rates is to something larger than intended, has led to something larger than intended. So that's the first approach. The second approach is to look at the departures between the realized harvest rates themselves and the target. And this one incorporates other things such as changes in the implementation of the target rate itself, implementation errors on catches, or not catch this year, but they are overall very similar. So in this case, we can take the highest departure we've seen so far, which is 32% intended to fish at 0.2, and as of this year, we estimate that we've been as high as 32%, which is 61% higher than the target. And these are other years, more recent years, as I mentioned. So we can use a working value at 32% departure from the target, and again, we revise down those target harvest rates, and we come back again to values that are around 0.13 for the areas that are using now 0.215 and 0.10 for areas that are having a target of 0.661. I think Bruce covered some of this in this presentation. It's just a potential waste. It's not a decision table, but more sort of a contingency table on how, because we don't know what is going to happen. It's coming back to the earlier question, what is going to happen next year? We're going to continue to have a retrospective pattern in the same direction or not. And these are two potential management actions. So in the short term, if we adjust those targets, we expect to have a modest yield, so smaller than, say, last year, or smaller than we would get if we use the current and adjusted target harvest rates. That's in the short term. In the long term, if the overestimation continues and we use the adjusted target harvest rates, we're trying to encompass, to cure the symptom, if you will, and we will expect to have modest yield as well. On the other hand, in long term, continuing to apply under the same conditions, if the overestimation continues, that could lead to a conservation risk, given that we get higher than target harvest rates, and we seem to have dropped below our threshold. These are other, of course, this is the only thing we can decide. We don't have a decision on this, whether it will happen or not, and these are the other options. So if long term we find out that the retrospective issue disappeared, we can return to the unadjusted target harvest rates. In the other hand, if there's no retrospective issue and underestimation or underestimation starts, well, we get a much higher yield levels. And I think I probably should stop there because all these things that were covered in this presentation.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks.
Okay.
There might be questions, but we weren't bashful about asking them during your presentation, so maybe there are no more.
That clears things up, though.
Okay. At this point, I would suggest we sort of end the webinar. Okay, so those folks listening on the webinar, that's the end of our presentation for today. Thank you very much for your attention.